Chapter 26. Poor escape plans and giant snakes. It had been a full 2 weeks since the chamber had been opened, and the entire school was thoroughly convinced, thanks to Ron and Seamus, that Salazar was behind it all. There were whispers, stares, and people were outright avoiding him in the corridors as if he was going to kill them all. Salazar thought the whole thing was funny though, and took to yelling, "Boogity boo, come forth giant snake," while waving his arms over his head every time someone looked at him fearfully. It certainly didn't help that Godric, Blaise, Neville, and the twins loudly called out "Make way for the heir of Slytherin" everywhere he went, and sarcastically bowed every time he walked into a room they were in. Salazar would always laugh, nod, and say "Thank you, my faithful subjects" before taking his seat in an over-exaggerated manner. Hermione rolled her eyes every time they did it, and Colin took pictures every chance he got. Salazar really hammed it up for Colin though, and posed every which way he could think of for him. It had finally begun to sink in with the rest of the school though, and now every time they acted out the part most of the students would grin and giggle before scurrying away. Ravenclaw House began realizing that the whole notion was silly because he would not be acting like this if he really was the heir of Slytherin. He would be reserved, cold, and uncaring just like every other Slytherin. Not to mention, the heir would not go around yelling "Boogity boo," and they began to voice their opinions on the matter. Students from Hufflepuff and Gryffindor started listening to their reasoning. They were Ravenclaws after all, and began acting fearful in Salazar's presence just so they could laugh when he did it. This new change did not sit well with Ron Weasley though, and he began threatening Salazar again and claimed that he better watch his back. The only house that did not find the whole thing funny was Slytherin itself, and Salazar, Godric, and Blaise were really more concerned about them. Draco was in a bitter mood and was loudly complaining about how Salazar had been getting all the attention lately, but it wasn't just Draco who was angry. The rest of the house wasn't happy with the way Salazar and the others had been acting about the chamber incident, and began trying to hex them all behind their backs. Godric had already stunned several 6th and 7th years, and Salazar and Blaise had placed a bunch of them in the full-body bind curse. Slytherin House was also upset because they had lost the Quidditch match to Gryffindor last weekend, thanks to the new brooms donated by Godric. They didn't lose just because of Gryffindor's new brooms though, they lost because Draco was a terrible seeker. During the game, Draco spent more time running his mouth and insulting the Gryffindor seeker than he did looking for the snitch, and Slytherin lost by 180 points when the Gryffindor seeker caught it. When Godric and Blaise pointed out that both teams had been nearly tied and they only lost because of Draco, no one saw it that way and blamed the brooms. Draco especially took great offense to that and threatened them. Needless to say, the 3 outcast Slytherins were watching their backs carefully. "Luna, are you sure? Because we don't want to make light of what happened if you're not comfortable with it," Godric whispered. "I think it's rather funny, Gordy," she said with a dreamy smile. "I don't mind at all, but I do thank you for asking me first. It really was an unpleasant experience, even if I can't remember what the giant snake looked like." It was nearing the end of their charms class, and Godric decided to take the opportunity to ask Luna her thoughts on the final portion of the prank they had planned for tonight. After all, she was the one who was attacked and he really didn't feel comfortable going through with it if she didn't want them to. "In fact, I think it would be a good way to further show how ridiculous everyone was being when they thought it had been Harry," Luna continued. "And now that I'm back to normal, everyone keeps asking me what it looked like, how scary it was, and if I'm all right. The last part doesn't bother me, but it is getting a little old now. I was only in the hospital wing for 4 days," she said with a shrug, as she levitated her feather off the desk. "Would you like to be a part of our prank, so that your friends know that we aren't picking on you?" "Oh, I don't have any friends because people think I'm strange, but I would love to be a part of your prank, if it's okay with the others." "Well, I don't think you're strange, and I know that the others won't mind you taking part," he whispered. "That's good to know," she said with a smile. You and Harry are different than any Slytherin I have ever heard about. Did you know that? You two don't act like the rest of them. Neither does Blaise, now that I think about it. Why do you say that? Godric asked curiously. Because all the other Slytherins are cold and don't show emotion all that much. It takes a lot to get them to show another face, other than the I'm bored look. It makes them unapproachable, and I think that's why they don't have many friends outside their own house. Godric chuckled and shook his head. Ah yes, the infamous Slytherin mask. It's quite the funny concept really. Most people think we are emotionless zombies running around with no feelings because we are unreadable. It's idiotic if you ask me, but most Slytherins think they can get an edge over their enemies if they put on that silly face. Personally, I find it boring and don't care a bit for it, and Harry thinks it's hysterical. Luna laughed lightly. I heard that was the type of man Salazar Slytherin really was, and all Slytherins mold themselves after him. I can't imagine what the other three founders must have thought about him. Godric shifted around in his seat. He knew exactly where that perceived image had come from, but he looked at Luna, gave her a small smile, and quickly changed the subject. So anyway, if you want to take part in our prank, just do as I suggested when the time comes. Hopefully people will get a pretty good laugh out of the whole thing. Luna giggled. I think they will. After all, a giant pink and purple polka-dotted snake does seem pretty funny. She replied, just as the bell rang. They said goodbye to each other, and since it was the last class of the day, Godric headed down to the dungeons to put his books and things in his dorm. He knew Salazar and Blaise would be there soon, and decided to wait for them in the common room. They were going to meet Hermione, Neville, Colin, and the twins in an unused classroom on the first floor to put the final touches on the prank they planned to play at dinner. Hermione was fully against the idea because she was afraid they would get in trouble, but she had agreed to be there for moral support and to make sure they didn't do anything dumb. After Godric put his books in the dorms, he sat down by the fireplace, took out his black diary and began studying its pages. He hadn't shown the diary to Salazar yet, but he knew he needed to. He was stuck on an idea and wasn't sure how to work it out, and he was hoping that Salazar would have a few good ideas. He had only been sitting there for a few minutes, when his diary was suddenly snatched off the table. He jumped up, expecting more 6th and 7th years to be standing around him, but instead he came face to face with a floating and grinning poltergeist. Give it back, Peeves, he demanded sternly as he glared at the menace. You can't hurt Peevesy right now, Lord Gryffindor, he said with a mad cackle. Can't banish me, can't banish me. Lord Slytherinus isn't here to help you, Peeves sang, as he held the diary over Godric's head. Peeves, I'm warning you, Godric said, holding his hand out. Give me the book now. Why does Lord Gryffindor want the book so badly? Peeves thinks that Lord Gryffindor is up to something, the poltergeist said with a grin, as he flipped through the diary. Oh, what is this? Dark object detect. Peeves, Godric yelled. He didn't want Peeves to say anything else, seeing as a bunch of his fellow housemates had already entered the common room. They were now standing around smirking at him, and Godric could see some of those 6th and 7th years laughing to themselves. He had a sneaking suspicion that they had put Peeves up to this by bribing him. Godric would have summoned the book, if he hadn't already placed it under an anti-summoning charm. The best he could hope for now was Salazar arriving, and hope that Peeves didn't take off with the diary before then. Why, hello, headmaster, Peeves said in a sickly sweet voice. Godric's whole body tensed up and he whirled around to see Albus making his way into the room. Thankfully though, so was Salazar and Blaise, though Salazar was glaring at Albus behind his back, and Blaise also looked less than pleased. Godric could only guess that Albus was up to his usual prattle and harassment of Salazar. It seems Lord Gryffindor has a book that he doesn't want anyone to see. Peeves thinks it's full of dark magic, he sang, waving the diary in the air. "Please give me the book, Peeves," Albus said with sudden alarm. "I must take a look at it." "No," Godric shouted, lunging for the diary, but Peeves retreated higher above their heads. "Why can't Peevesy give this book to the headmaster? Let's see what else is in here," he said, flipping to the next page. "Oh TSK Lord Gryffy. Are you planning on messing with the protective boards around Hogwarts? One mustn't do that behind the headmaster's back," he said with glee. Albus stared at Peeves, then glanced at Godric, who had already whipped out his wand. "Salazar!" he shouted, as Salazar ran forward. "Why, Lord Slytherinus, how good to see ... Don't banish Peeves!" the poltergeist screamed, as Salazar began to loudly chant the banishing spell. Peeves instantly dropped the diary and fled the room, but Albus tried to summon the book before it hit the floor, to no avail. At the same moment, Godric lunged forward and caught it in midair. Then he tucked it in his robes and turned to face Albus, who was now glowering at the both of them. "Mr. Ruffin, I request that book," he said sternly. "I'm sorry, headmaster, but that is not going to happen," Godric replied, as Salazar stood firmly next to his friend. "Harry, get away from him," Albus said. "He could be dangerous." "He's not dangerous, headmaster," Salazar said, rolling his eyes. "And I highly doubt that book has anything to do with the wards. Gordy has been writing in that diary all year. It's mostly about his mum, who is sick at the moment. Those kinds of ramblings are hardly anything to worry about." "It's true," Godric said, quickly picking up the lie. "It's just a diary of my thoughts and things. You know how Peeves is, Professor. He's always making something up." "Then you won't mind if I take a quick look?" Albus said with a gentle smile. "Actually I do. I don't mean any disrespect, headmaster, but what is written in my diary doesn't concern you." Albus's gentle smile immediately turned cold and more forced. "I'm afraid I must disagree," he said, pulling out his wand. "Please let me take a look at the diary, for my own peace of mind. Peeves has laid down some serious accusations after all." Godric eyed Albus's wand closely, and Salazar could feel his friend's body stiffen, as if he was getting ready for a duel. He knew he had to diffuse the tension, or there would likely be spells cast from both wizards. "Professor, Gordy is only 11. How in the world could he tamper with the wards around the school? I have read about wands and can only do minor ones, but the ones around Hogwarts are a lot more complicated." "There seems to be a lot of things the two of you can do, Harry. Most of the spells should be above your age and magical capabilities, but they seem to not be a hindrance to either of you. I will not let this school be put in danger. I request the diary," Albus said firmly. "A fine speech coming from the likes of you, headmaster," Godric spat. "Does a Cerberus and a Griffin ring any bells? I've heard all about those." "Shut up, Godric," Salazar whispered out of the side of his mouth, but in the dead silent room, everyone heard every word. Albus glared at the both of them, and tilted his head to the side. "You two seem to call each other Salazar and Godric a lot more than you should. Why is that?" he asked, ignoring Godric's accusation. "I've already told you. It's a joke," Godric said in a cold tone. "Now, if you will excuse me, I have to go to the library." "I'm afraid you can't leave this room until I have looked at your diary, Mr. Ruffin," Albus said, blocking his way. "Fine, then I'll just have to find a different route," Godric said stubbornly, turning his back on Albus. Out of the corner of his eye, Salazar saw Godric look around and spot one of the Quidditch players who had just come down from his dorm with his broom. He grinned, then produced a familiar-looking green potion out of his pocket and discreetly drank half of it down. He winked at Salazar, and inconspicuously handed the potion to him. Salazar stared at Godric with wide eyes, and briefly wondered why his best friend was walking around with it in his pocket. but then he became distracted because of the mischievous look on Godric's face. He had seen that look before, and it usually didn't bode well. For Salazar, that is. Mr. Ruffin, as you can see, there is no other way out of here. Now, give me the diary so I can look through it. If it is what you say it is, then you have nothing to hide. Albus said, glaring at Godric's back. Godric scowled and turned to face Albus. I don't want you to see it because it is my personal business. I choose who I share it with, and I don't choose you. Then I'm sorry, I'm afraid I must do this. Albus said with a sigh, and suddenly ropes appeared from the end of his wand. Unfortunately for Albus, Godric knew a thing or two and instantly vanished the ropes, while at the same time Salazar hit him with an impediment jinx. Albus's movements slowed down immediately, and a look of astonishment slowly appeared on his face. What did you two do? Blaise cried, but they ignored him. Knowing that they only had a short minute or two to escape before Albus returned to normal, and not really knowing what Godric was up to, Salazar quickly unraveled Nora from his wrist and gave her to Blaise. Godric turned towards the Quidditch team, who had all gathered to watch the two of them face off with Albus before heading off to practice, and aimed his wand at Draco. Accio Draco's broom! Godric cried, and the broom sailed towards them. Oh no! 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 I'm not getting on that! Salazar started to yell, but he was cut off when Godric grabbed him under the arms and threw him on the back of the broom. Give me back my broom! Draco screamed, just as Godric kicked off from the ground. No, Godric! The other way! The other way! Salazar yelled as they zoomed toward one of the windows. Now, flying towards a closed window on a broom, after you have drank the potion that will allow you to walk through such things, wouldn't have been a big deal. Unfortunately, however, Salazar built the Slytherin common room half under the Black Lake, and the window they were speeding towards led directly into said lake. Godric, don't you dare! No! Salazar screamed in his ear, but Godric only laughed loudly. Towards the castle. Towards the castle. Not the lake, you bloody Gryffindor. Hold your nose! Godric shouted gleefully. Ugh! The last thing Salazar heard before he, Godric, and the broom zoomed out of the window and into the freezing cold water was, "Speaker, get off that crazy contraption." He had really wanted to, but that crazy, idiotic, insane, bloody Gryffindor wouldn't let him. The icy cold water hit Salazar like 1,000 needles, but through the pain of it all, he somehow managed to cast a bubble head charm around his head so that he wouldn't drown. Godric swam up next to him, grinning like the fool that he was, and they both watched the broom sink to the bottom of the lake. Then he watched as Godric swam back over to the window, cancel his own bubble head charm, stick his head back into the window, and yell something at Albus before grabbing Salazar's arm and heading towards the surface. I am going to kill him, Salazar thought, as he took one last glance back into the warm common room. The entire house was staring at them with their mouths hanging open and with dumbfounded expressions on their faces. Blaise had jumped on top of the table that was sitting under the window and was apparently yelling something, but of course, he couldn't hear him. Draco looked angry over the loss of his broom and was yelling at Albus, who was staring wide-eyed at the window in total disbelief. That was the last thing he saw though, before Godric tugged on him again and they began swimming towards the surface. He could hear Godric's muffled, gleeful laughter as they swam as fast as they could towards the surface, and he glared at his completely insane best friend. I am going to find a way to murder him. I am going to strangle him. I am going to hex him. I am going to chop him up into little pieces and use his body parts for potions ingredients. I am going to. You bloody Gryffindor! He bellowed, as they broke through the thin ice that covered the surface of the lake. I am going to kill you. That was brilliant! Godric exclaimed, as he laughed and grinned wickedly. Wow, this cold water really wakes you up, doesn't it? You idiot! What was the point in that? Salazar yelled, as he began to strangle a still grinning Godric, but he couldn't quite get his frozen fingers around his friend's neck. "Well, I did say I'd find another way out, didn't I?" Godric chuckled, when Salazar finally gave up and released him. "That's what I said to Albus, by the way. Salazar, we have got to do that again." Salazar picked up a thin piece of floating ice and whopped him over the head with it, but Godric paid it no mind as he continued his manic grinning. "Godric, I swear on Merlin's grave that when I thaw out, I'm going to find a way to kill you," he grumbled. "Merlin doesn't have a grave, my friend, and deep down you know that was bloody amazing." "I am soaking wet and frozen." "No, that wasn't bloody amazing," he growled. "Oh, come on. Remember that time Helga turned us both into fish and banished us into this very lake? That was for 3 days in the middle of December. This is nowhere near as bad as that was. She only did that because you talked me into setting loose a bunch of toads in her office." "I know, that was funny, wasn't it?" Godric chuckled. Salazar rolled his eyes, but suddenly stopped and grabbed a hold of Godric's robes. "Shush!" he whispered fiercely. "What?" Godric asked in alarm as he stopped thrashing around. "Is it the Grindlows?" "No, it's Albus. He's with Minerva, Poppy, Severus, and Remus." "Oh bloody hell!" Godric whispered. "They had to have come up by now. Spread out, and look along the edges. It's starting to get rather dark out here." They heard Albus yell, "Harry! Mr. Ruffin! Can you hear me? Potter! Ruffin! I swear if you two don't answer me, you will have detention for the rest of the year." Severus yelled with a mixture of anger and worry in his voice. "Severus is quite the character, isn't he?" Godric chuckled. "You have probably given all of them a near nervous breakdown. You just wait until Poppy gets a hold of us. I'll make sure you take all the blame," Salazar whispered maliciously. Godric shivered, and stared at him with wide eyes. "You wouldn't?" he asked through chattering teeth, because the cold water was starting to get to him. "Oh, I would," Salazar answered through his own shivers. "I'm near frozen solid. We need to get out of this stupid lake." Godric sighed with disappointment. "Well, it was fun while it lasted. Let's head towards Minerva. She's the least likely one to kill me." "Don't bet on it. I'd pick Remus over her," Salazar answered. "We're over here," he yelled as loud as he could, seeing as his teeth were also chattering badly. They swam as fast as they could towards the shore, knocking thin sheets of ice out of their way as they went. Minerva looked ready to kill them both, but it was Poppy who sent 2 powerful stinging jinxes towards their backsides. "Ouch! It wasn't my fault. It was his brilliant idea," Salazar cried, as he pointed towards gleefully chuckling Godric. "I don't care. You two nearly scared us to death. Now wrap these warm blankets around yourselves this instant," she hissed, just as Albus, Severus, and Remus reached them. "Harry, Mr. Ruffin, I do hope you have a very good explanation for this," Albus said as he eyed the 2 shivering children carefully. "Yes, Potter, do delight us with your story," Severus said with a sneer, as Poppy and Minerva began drying them off with hot air charms. "Harry, what were you thinking?" Remus cried, but he looked like he was going to burst out laughing at any minute. Salazar stared at them all in bewilderment. Then he shouted, "It wasn't my fault. I didn't have a choice," he said, pointing an accusing finger at Godric, who were doubled over with laughter. "We can talk about this later," Poppy huffed. "We have to get them inside and warmed up before they catch their death." "It would serve them right." Minerva scowled, but then she smirked at them. "Although I do believe we aren't the only ones they have to worry about, because Miss Granger is in a right state at this point. Mr. Zarbini has apparently told her exactly what happened." "Uh-oh," Godric said, as all traces of laughter fled from his face. "She can be worse than a wet angry cat. No offense, Professor McGonagall." Minerva sent a stinging jinx at him, which Godric blocked, but Salazar rolled his eyes. "I swear, Gryffindors never think before they speak, or act apparently." "For once, Potter, I think I agree with you," Severus said with a nod. "That did it." Remus burst out laughing and they began to make their way towards the warm castle. Albus led the way, and appeared to be lost in deep thought. The others kept grinning, smirking, and snorting, and now that Salazar was dried off and somewhat warm, he finally started to laugh, which only made Godric start snickering again. "All right, I do admit that it was pretty good," Salazar whispered so that Albus couldn't hear him. "But next time make sure that it is warm outside." "Deal," Godric whispered with shining eyes, just as they reached the front doors of the castle. "What were you thinking?" a voice suddenly demanded. From out of nowhere, Salazar found himself being assaulted by a bushy-haired, book-wielding Hermione Granger. She began to whack him on the arms and shoulders with it, but thankfully she spared his head because the book was pretty thick. Disappearing out of a closed window, on a broom, and into the freezing cold lake. "What were you thinking?" she asked, hitting him with each word. "We're not worthy. We're not worthy," Fred and George cried in unison, only to have Hermione round on them. "This is not funny," she cried, chasing them for several feet and trying to hit them with her weapon. Blaise, Neville, and Colin were nearly doubled over with loud, boisterous laughter, and Minerva, Poppy, and Remus just stood and watched the scene with smirks on their faces. Albus looked slightly amused, and Severus looked bored, but his eyes were shining with laughter. "It wasn't my fault. Blame the Gryffindor in Slytherin robes," Salazar cried, pointing at Godric as he ducked to get away from another blow. Hermione seemed to falter a bit and she looked at Godric a bit uncertainly, but then she whopped him once with the book. "Don't ever scare me like that again," she cried, as Godric snorted loudly. "How did you manage this?" she demanded with a stomp of her foot, as she glared at Salazar. "An excellent question, Miss Granger," Albus said as he looked at them all with twinkling eyes. Hermione's eyes widened as she finally took note of just who was actually standing around them. Then her face reddened to a deep blush and she backed away quickly, while muttering an apology. "How did you both manage this?" Albus asked, turning a stern gaze towards Salazar and Godric. Godric cleared his throat, and managed to stifle a glare before replying. "I looked through the book Harry showed me that was written by Salazar Slytherin. I copied down the recipe for a potion that allows someone to walk through walls. I thought it was funny and could come in handy at some point. Turns out I was right." Albus glared at him. 10 points from Slytherin for brewing a dangerous potion unsupervised, and I still need that dairy of yours, Mr. Offen. Salazar glared at Albus, and noticed that Severus's wand hand flinched a bit. Godric, however, sighed and reached into his pocket. Then he paled drastically and began to frantically pat down his robes. I don't have it, sir. I think I lost it somewhere in the lake." Albus studied him closely for a moment, but then he sighed and nodded. "Very well. Let's get you two up to the hospital wing. I do believe you both need a pep-up potion. However, I must take 30 more points from Slytherin, and you both have detention with me for a full week, starting Monday." Severus glared at Albus and Godric, but Salazar couldn't tell which of them he wanted to hex the most. They all began to make their way towards the hospital wing, so that Poppy could give them the attention and stern talking to that she had been itching to give them. When they arrived, they were steered towards the 2 nearest beds and Poppy began her exams. When she was satisfied that they were all right, she proceeded to scold the 2 founders, who had the good common sense to look sheepish, gave them the pepper-up potion, and glared at them until they had drank every last drop. "I have half a mind to keep the 2 of you here until the morning, but," she said, throwing up her hand to stop their protests, "I know you have plans for tonight at dinner." They all sighed with relief, but Albus frowned at them. "What plans?" he asked. Hermione squeaked and then hissed, "I told you all this wasn't a good idea." "Don't worry, Headmaster, we have it all under control," Fred said as he bowed low. "We promise not to disappear into the lake, use freezing cold water, or do anything that would otherwise maim, harm, or kill anyone. Trust us," George said, as he too bowed low. As Fred said, "We have it under control. We have cleared everything with Madame Pomfrey, and she deems it safe." Albus chuckled and his eyes twinkled. "Then I look forward to being surprised. I shall see you all at dinner then." Albus was still chuckling as he left the hospital wing, but Godric glared at his retreating form. "If you and I had said that, he would have taken more points and told us not to do it." "Yes, his bias is appalling. Welcome to Hogwarts circa 1992, where Slytherins are the devil and Gryffindors can do no wrong," Salazar growled sarcastically. Godric frowned. "And what makes it worse is, he's the headmaster." "Indeed." Severus loudly cleared his throat, which made them realize that they weren't alone, seeing as the children were still present. If Blaise, Neville, and Colin were confused by the short conversation, they didn't let on. Hermione, on the other hand, studied them both closely with narrowed eyes, but she remained quiet. After getting scolded by Poppy one last time, they all left the hospital wing. Dinner was starting soon, so the professors went their separate ways, and the children, Salazar and Godric, headed for the unused classroom on the first floor. It was a short walk, but Salazar and Godric hung back while the twins distracted the others. "Did you really lose your diary?" Salazar whispered, keeping an eye on the children ahead of them. Godric shook his head. "No, I made that up on the spot." It seemed like a valid excuse. "Actually, I haven't told you what it is yet and I can't go into detail right now, but suffice to say, it does actually have something to do with the wards. I'm stuck with an idea that I have in mind." "Are you talking about the dark object detection ward?" "We were already working on that." "I know, but this is more in-depth. I'm trying to incorporate more family magic into the ward, but I just can't seem to work it out right. I've been stubborn with not telling you about it because of that," he said, looking at Salazar apologetically. "I know you'd never betray me or blabber to others about Gryffindor family magic, but it's just family magic," Salazar said, patting him on the shoulder. "Godric, I understand. You don't have to explain, or apologize. I would do the same thing." Godric gave him a small smile and nodded. "Thank you, my friend." Salazar nodded knowingly as they entered the classroom. The twins, Neville, and Blaise were already getting the giant snake ready as Hermione just shook her head and watched them. "I can't believe that we are actually going to do this after what the two of them just pulled," she said, looking right at Godric and Salazar. "You heard what the headmaster said, Hermione." Neville snorted, as he made more purple polka dots on the snake. "He is looking forward to it." "I know, but..." "Relax," Blaise said in a lazy tone. "We will be fine. By the way, Gordy, Draco is very angry at you for stealing his broom, and is..." "Let me guess," Salazar interrupted in a bored voice, as he rolled his eyes. "Threatening to tell his father about this?" Blaise grinned at him. "Yep," he said with a nod. "I figured that was going to happen. Don't worry, I plan on giving him the money to replace it," Godric said with a sigh. "I'll tell him that at dinner." After that, the conversation turned to the night's upcoming events. Godric told everyone about his conversation with Luna earlier in the day, and everyone stared at each other in horror. Not because of Luna's involvement, but because of their insensitivity over the matter. Hermione started a new round of fretting, and Salazar couldn't believe that he hadn't even thought about her and how she would feel. Godric assured them that Luna was fine with it though, and told them that she was looking forward to be included in their plan. This eased everyone's conscience a little. However, there was another part of the plan that was unknown by the rest of them, with the exception of Fred and George. This was the part that everyone in the know was hoping would wake Albus up and make him realize that Harry wasn't the bad guy. At least that's what they all hoped could happen anyway. The plan was to let the children have enough time to eat, so they decided to wait until dinner was half over, and just so that they would all be together, the Gryffindors decided to eat at the Slytherin table. When they entered the Great Hall, all of Slytherin House started whispering and staring at Godric and Salazar, but they just shrugged and decided not to pay any attention to them. The first half of dinner passed peacefully, despite the usual glares and grumbling from the other Slytherins, but as soon as they had scarfed down their dinner, Neville, Blaise, Fred, George, and Godric left. Hermione and Colin left to go sit at the Gryffindor table, and Salazar stayed sitting in his normal spot at the Slytherin table. 5 minutes later, Salazar suddenly jumped up and stood on the bench seat. No one really paid attention to him at first, but he suddenly let out a loud yell, and started waving his hands in the air. "Attention, mere peasants of Hogwarts. I, Harry Potter, now proclaim myself lord over you all, simply because I'm an evil, no good, slimy Slytherin. Accept me now, or you will perish." Remus nearly choked on his dessert, and Minerva just barely managed to hide a snort as Salazar placed his hand on his hips and puffed out his chest. Everyone else though, just stared at him like he'd gone mental. Salazar ignored their looks and continued. "Due to my evil Slytheriness, and your refusal to do as I say, I shall now summon the giant snake," he shouted, and this time people began to look slightly afraid. Salazar started to wave his wand in an over-exaggerated, complicated manner, and spoke, "O giant snake of Slytherins, come forth!" he yelled. "Come and claim your mole-born and half-blood victims. Giant snake, boogity-boo, come forth!" he shouted as he waved his arms again. Despite her earlier protests, Salazar could see Hermione trying to cover her giggles, but Colin jumped up and literally began to run in circles while screaming at the top of his lungs. "Run! Run! He going to wait, what's my line again?" he asked with a snicker. "Kill, Colin. He's going to kill us all," Salazar staged whispered to him, though it was loud enough for the whole Great Hall to hear. "Oh yeah. He's going to kill us all. Ouch!" he screamed, as he ran around in more circles, causing the camera around his neck to bounce around on his chest. Just then the Great Hall's doors flew open, and a giant pink and purple polka-dotted snake walked slithered in. It looked like a few old bed sheets had been sewn together and showed signs of horribly done color-changing charms. The snake had legs that were clothed in black slacks, only because Godric, Blaise, and Neville had the sheets draped over their heads, and the snake's head had holes for eyes. Its tongue hung limply out of its mouth, and looked suspiciously like an old frayed shoestring. By this time the entire Great Hall was laughing, and even a few of the more stuck-up Slytherins were chuckling. Others however, namely Ron Weasley, didn't seem too impressed. Salazar snorted, despite trying not to, and continued. "O great serpent of Slytherin, get them!" The snake turned its gaze toward the Ravenclaw table, and Luna giggled, immediately fell over, and laid on the floor in a stiffened position. A Ravenclaw prefect by the name of Penelope Clearwater also started laughing and fell over, as a few others followed their lead. Colin screamed again, ran over to the snake, took a picture, and also fell over just as the snake turned its gaze towards the Hufflepuff table. Justin Finch-Fletchley, a Mole-born, was laughing so hard that he didn't realize that the snake was pointedly starting at him until a friend elbowed him, and he also fell over. The entire Great Hall was in an uproar over the whole thing. Most were laughing at the ridiculousness of it, while others were flopping around on the floor and laughing as it turned their way. Some of the professors were trying to restore order, while others laughed and enjoyed the show. Albus couldn't decide what to do, so he sat at the head table taking it all in with a smile on his face. Severus on the other hand, had already had enough and marched over to the snake and ripped the sheet off of their heads. I should have known. Ruffin, Zarbini, and Longbottom," he drawled, as they grinned at the destruction they had caused. But then Severus turned towards Salazar. "Potter, get down here." Salazar tried his best to look sheepish, but failed miserably as he caught sight of Godric sticking his tongue out at Severus, whose back was turned. He started laughing, and half walked, half tripped over his own feet as he made his way over to his friends. "What is the meaning of this?" Severus demanded as he shook the sewn-together sheets in front of his face. Before he could answer, the great hall's doors flew open again, and Fred and George came charging in. They were waving wooden swords above their heads. "We will save you, students of Hogwarts!" they shouted in unison, but stopped dead when they realized what was going on. "I think someone beat us to it, Fred." "I think you are right, George." Severus glared at them and summoned the swords. When they sailed to him, he glanced down and sneered. The wooden swords were painted silver, with a painted red ruby on the handle, and the words Godric Gryffindor were burned into the blade portion. "What is this nonsense?" he snarled. "The sword of Gryffindor," Salazar answered sheepishly, while shuffling his feet. "We remembered what it looked like from last year." Godric snorted, but remained quiet. The twins grinned and tried to slink away, however Severus glared at them, and they came to stand beside the others. "Creevy!" Severus suddenly shouted. "You get over here as well, and Granger, you too." But she didn't. Neville started to protest, but he was cut off by another glare from Severus. The 5 Gryffindors and 3 Slytherins stood in front of the angry-looking potions master, ready for whatever punishment would fall on them, but it was Remus who stood up and spoke. "Professor Snape, what harm have they done?" he asked as he made his way down to them. When he got closer, Salazar grinned as he spotted the 2 shrunken mirrors that resembled buttons, which were attached to his shirt collar. He knew that Sirius, Lily, and James were laughing themselves silly over the whole incident. "No one has been hurt, and everyone had a good laugh," Remus continued. "That is something that we could all use around here, especially now, seeing as the Dementors are doing their best to suck the happiness out of everyone. Don't you agree?" Severus glared at the werewolf. "No, I do not," he answered in a clipped tone. "And Potter has all but admitted that he is the heir of Slytherin, and I think he needs to be punished." He sneered as he grabbed a hold of Salazar's robes. "No. No!" Salazar cried. "I'm not the heir of Slytherin. I'm actually the heir of Gryffindor." The entire hall became still and quiet as everyone stared at him, but it was Hermione that broke the silence. "What?" she cried. "How do you know that?" "A book," Salazar answered, as Severus roughly released him and stared at him in shock. Hermione looked at him curiously. "What book?" Salazar sighed and turned to face her. "Gordy told me that every ancient wizarding family has a self-updating book that records each birth, death, and marriage. He also said since the Potter family is old, that we would likely have one. I snuck off the grounds by using the flue in Professor Lupin's office. I went to Gringotts and looked through my family's vault until I found it," he said, and flinched when a hurtful look entered her eyes. He really hated having to lie to the children. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked quietly. "I'm sorry, Hermione, but I didn't want people to know. I thought that people would think I was bragging. When I found the book, I began to trace the Potter line back through the centuries. For a while I thought maybe I was the heir of Slytherin because of the Parseltongue, and the fact that I am in Slytherin house. I thought that maybe I was somehow responsible for what happened to Luna, and maybe I didn't know it. I thought I was being controlled somehow, or something. I don't know, but Gordy and I went searching. That's when we found out that I am actually the heir of Gryffindor," he said quietly. Then he turned to face a shocked-looking Albus and continued. "Godric Gryffindor had 2 sons. One of them was killed in battle before he had a chance to marry, but the other went on and had a son of his own. From that line, One of Gryffindor's great-great-great-granddaughters married a man named Ignatius Peevill in the mid-1200s, and they also had a son. From there, one of the however many greats, Peevill granddaughters married a man named Jonathan Harold Potter, and I, Harry Potter, stand before you as the last remaining heir of Godric Gryffindor. It's the truth, and I would be willing to swear an oath to prove it. As Salazar finished his mini-speech, everyone in the Great Hall stared at him. Several Ravenclaws looked intrigued and deep in thought, the Hufflepuffs began whispering amongst themselves, the Gryffindors looked confused, and the Slytherins looked shocked. Salazar looked up at Remus and sighed again. I know I was wrong to sneak off school grounds, and I'm sorry I broke into your office, Professor Lupin, but I didn't know what else to do. I just wanted to know for sure," he said quietly, as he hung his head and stared at the floor. "It's all right, Harry," Remus said softly as he patted Salazar's shoulders. "I understand why. I just wish you would have told me what you were doing. Perhaps I could have helped. I didn't know if you would or not. Adults have never tried to help me before. That's why I have learned to do things myself. It's just easier that way. No one would stick up for me, and until we started this prank, everyone thought it was me. No one believed that I wasn't the heir, and like I said earlier, I thought I was a horrible person because I thought I was being controlled. I thought that I was somehow doing it. No one would help me. No one would stick up for me, except my friends," he said with a small smile in their direction. "Even the headmaster thought it was me. What does that tell you?" If Remus didn't know the truth, his heart would have broken into a million pieces, but instead he glared up at Albus, who was sitting at the head table staring at Harry in shock. Albus finally stood up though, and cleared his throat as he glanced around the room. "Harry, I never thought that you were the heir of Slytherin." "Liar!" Godric shouted. "How dare you sit up there and—" Godric suddenly found himself ranting silently at Albus, but only because Salazar hit him with a silencing charm. "I'm sorry, Gordy, but I don't want you to get into trouble. This is my fight, not yours," he said, as he glared up at Albus. "But Gordy is right, Headmaster. You are a liar. You did think it was me. That's why you have yet to deny my involvement in this mess. I have absolutely no trust in you whatsoever. You can't see past the fact that I'm a Slytherin and not a Gryffindor like you so clearly hoped. Your bias is appalling, and the way you have treated me this year would make my parents roll over in their graves. You sit up there and look down your nose on all Slytherins, just because of the simple fact that they are Slytherins. Not all of us are bad, you know. There are good people like Blaze and Gordy, for example. It's just that, unlike you, we can see grey. Not all things are black and white, or to put it in terms you are familiar with, not all things are light and dark. You don't like Slytherins because we see grey. We don't conform to your way of thinking, and that bothers you." "Harry," Albus said with a stern glare. "You are too young to know what—" "Spare me the too young speech, Headmaster. It is you who is too young to know what you are talking about," Salazar said, promptly cutting Albus off. "I agree," Godric said through gritted teeth. Obviously the silencing charm had worn off of clearly irate Godric, who was red-faced with anger and near his breaking point. "Where are you going?" Salazar asked in confusion as Godric stomped away. "I'm leaving. If I stay here, I'm going to say or do something rash. That man is getting on my last nerve. He is an unworthy Gryffindor." "Unworthy?" he shouted, as he shook his fist and glared at Albus, but then he turned back to Salazar. "I need to go. I'll be back later." "All right," Salazar said in bewilderment, as he watched his enraged best friend storm out of the Great Hall. Salazar knew it was for the best, seeing as Godric had a tendency to speak before thinking about things. Albus watched him go, but then he sighed. "Harry, Mr. Ruffin didn't let me explain," he said, as he leaned against the head table. I never thought you were the heir of Slytherin. I just thought you had something to do with the opening of the chamber. So the message left by the heir of Slytherin meant what? Remus asked. Albus looked down at them with tired eyes. I thought that Harry had left the message because the heir told him to. I thought that Harry was working for him. Everyone glared at Albus, but Poppy was the one who exploded. Albus, he's 12. She bellowed, as she jumped up and knocked over her chair. How could you think something like that? I know. I'm sorry. I was wrong about it all, he said, glancing around the Great Hall. Everyone, return to your houses. Professors remain here, and you all as well, he said, pointing to Salazar and the children. As the Great Hall slowly emptied out, the students began buzzing about all of this new information, but Salazar didn't mind. He had gotten what he wanted, and Albus had admitted that he was wrong. He didn't know that it was going to go quite this far, or with so many people around, but hopefully now everyone would start opening up their eyes and think for themselves. Albus sat down heavily and sighed once again. Harry, I'm sorry for what I have done, but there are things that you don't understand. Then explain them to me, Salazar pleaded. I can't. You're too young, he said simply. And I don't think you are ready for it all. Salazar once again glared at Albus, but he knew full well that the headmaster wasn't going to say anything in this situation. Salazar sighed and shook his head. Then you leave me no choice but to figure things out for myself. Headmaster, I can tell you with full confidence that you will one day regret the decisions that you have made on my behalf. First was sticking me with those magic-hating moles, and secondly was not telling me things I clearly need to know. You and I both know that Voldemort is not dead, and we both know why, he said, leveling his gaze and looking directly into Albus's eyes. Salazar could have kicked himself. He hadn't meant to say that, and judging by the sudden realization that had sprung up in Albus's eyes, he knew that Albus now knew Harry was more knowledgeable about things than he was letting on about. The headmaster studied Salazar for a moment, before looking down his nose at him. Harry, is there anything you wish to tell me? No, Salazar replied curtly. If you won't share information with me, then I won't share information with you. You have to give, in order to receive. Potter! Severus shouted, only to be waved off by Albus. No, Severus, in a way he is correct, even if he is going about it in a childish manner, Albus said with an amused smile. As I'm sure you are aware, the young often think they know better than adults. It's a phase that all children go through. Indeed it is, Salazar agreed with a smirk. For once, headmaster, we agree on something. However, there is something I wish to tell you. When the time comes, Voldemort will die by my hand one way or another. As will any Death Eater who stands with him. They will all die. A true look of concern engulfed Albus and he stared at Salazar in alarm. Harry, you mustn't kill people. They can change. I've already told you that. And I suppose you think Tom Riddle falls into that category, Salazar stated with a chuckle, as Albus reeled back in shock. He doesn't, I assure you, and he will be dealt with by me, with or without your help. I prefer with your help, seeing as you know more about him than I do, but I guess that's not going to happen. So, I will just have to go it alone. You're not alone, Harry, Neville suddenly said in a voice that was cold as ice. Salazar had never heard him use it before, and it took him by surprise as he looked at his young friend. I will be the two. I will fight with you. I don't know who that Tom bloke is, but someone like Bellatrix Lestrange does not deserve to live. Not after what she did to Neva and that, but she is alive. And others are barely alive, he said, as his voice cracked and a tear slipped down his cheek. If war comes again, I'll be there. I'm not afraid, he stated firmly, as he drew himself up to his full height. Neville stood there with a look on his face that dared anyone to tell him otherwise, and Salazar wasn't about to. They were children that had truly been affected by the last war, and he knew that they had real grievances against those that had perpetrated it, and for Albus to stand there in front of them pleading for the lives of murderers made Salazar absolutely sick. In all his many years of life, he had seen wars come and go. He knew that only in rare instances did someone truly change their ways. People like Severus did not come along often, and he knew that someone like Malfoy and the Lestranges were not one of them. They craved death and destruction, and would not go down without a real fight. It hurt Salazar to know that they were only children, but children, he knew, could sometimes surprise you. They had a strength that was oftentimes lost to world-weary adults, and as Salazar looked into Neville's face, he vowed right then and there to protect and guide not just Neville, but all of them should they choose to fight the war that was surely coming. He glanced up at Fred and George as they each laid a hand on Neville's shoulders. "Death Eaters killed our uncles. We know what you are going through, Neville, and we will fight too," George said firmly, as Fred nodded in agreement. Hermione sniffed and wiped the tears from her cheeks. "I don't know a whole lot about the Wizarding War, but my mum's brother fought in the Gulf War that just ended back in January. I don't know what it means to fight a war, but I will do what I can to help." "As will I," Colin said quietly. "My great-grandfather fought in World War II. He was a photographer. He may not have actually killed anyone, but he still had to carry a gun. He took pictures of things that were horrible, and he saw a lot of things he wished he hadn't. I am proud of my great-grandfather though. He passed away before I was born, but my mum told me stories about him and said I got my love of photography from him. If a war is coming, I will be there, and just like Hermione, I will do what I can." "Me as well," Blaise said suddenly. "I don't know whether I've been hanging around too many Gryffindors, but I will also do what I can. You can count on me, Harry." Salazar looked at his young friends with tears in his eyes. "I vow to do everything within my power to protect you and your families," he said sincerely, as he gave the twins a knowing look. "You have my word." "Mine too." Salazar turned sharply to see that Godric had re-entered the Great Hall at some point, and he nodded at his best friend. "True Gryffindors," Godric said as he gazed upon them with his arms folded across his chest. "I am proud of you, and you honor Gryffindor with your bravery," he said with a proud smile. The children looked slightly confused with Gordy's statement, but a strangled sob escaped from Minerva as she dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Severus glanced at Salazar, and subtly nodded. Remus and Poppy both looked slightly worried, and they shot a look towards Salazar, but remained quiet. Salazar knew they both had questions, and he was more than willing to answer them later. Albus, on the other hand, looked around at them with an ever-increasing look of concern. He cleared his throat, and Salazar stiffened because of what he knew Albus was about to say. "Harry, while you and your friends' words are admirable, you all have no idea what you are saying. I agree that Voldemort is not dead, and I agree that he may one day return, but we do not know when that day is. However, revenge is a slippery slope, and it will lead you to darkness." Salazar opened his mouth to retort, but Neville beat him to it. "What do you know about it?" he shouted. "What have you done to stop him? Tell us, what have you lost to you-know-who and his Death Eaters? All my gram would tell me about you, is that you were working on a way to end the war. Well, it seems to me that your way didn't work. If it wasn't for Harry, we'd probably still be dealing with you-know-who." "Voldemort, Neville," Salazar said softly. "Call him Voldemort. He wants people to fear him, and I'm sure he gets a good laugh over the name you-know-who. Don't give him what he wants." Neville fearfully glanced at Salazar, but then a hard look flashed in his eyes. "Vive Voldemort," he said defiantly, as Salazar gave him an encouraging smile. Neville turned back towards Albus and glared at him. "So Professor, tell us, what have you lost to Voldemort and the Death Eaters?" he asked again. Albus sighed and shook his head. "You are only children. You do not understand what you are asking, nor do you understand what you are vowing to do. Oh, I think we understand a lot more than you think, Godric said. Your problem is that you can't see past age. Yours, or ours. Gordy's right, Salazar said with a chuckle. Regardless of who is right or wrong, you are all just children and have no idea what you are talking about. This conversation is now over, and I don't want to hear any more talk about war from any of you, he said sternly as he glared at them. Now, it is getting late and I suggest you all head to your common rooms. One would think that Albus's lack of response would make Salazar angry, and normally it would, but in this case Salazar couldn't help but laugh. He knew Albus was only working off preconceived knowledge. Albus truly did think Harry was only 12, but Albus's problem is that he truly thinks he knows what's best for everyone. Salazar could throw caution to the wind and tell Albus the truth. Salazar could tell him that he was Salazar Slytherin and that Gordy was Godric Gryffindor, but that would only lead to questions that Salazar didn't want to answer. He didn't want to explain about the Potters, nor did he want to tell Albus about his friendship with Severus, Minerva, Poppy, and Remus. He didn't trust Albus enough to not mess anything up, or to sabotage his plans in some way. He just couldn't take that chance. So for now he would bide his time. Albus would eventually confide in someone. Salazar just hoped that the information would be useful and not full of Albus's mindless drivel.
Hey guys, what's going on? Thank you so much for watching today's episode. If you guys want to watch more like it, please subscribe to my channel and become part of the video game fanfiction plot. And please leave a comment down below and hit that like button. If you guys have any suggestions on any stories you guys want me to read, don't hesitate. They're always welcome here in the video game fanfic plot. That also goes for video games. Until next time, goodbye!